Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second video on your introduction to Python. All right. Today, we will be going through quite a lot. To be quite interactive, and we'll be using an IDE, one of the most, actually the most popular IDE. I stand to be corrected. Visual Studio Code. All right. So in the last video, we downloaded Python, we downloaded Visual Studio Code. And okay, I don't think we downloaded Visual Studio Code, but I'll show you the link on where you can download it, right? And in this video, I'll quickly run through the slides. Essentially, what we're going to discuss is data types, right? The various data types that are available in Python, how to use them, what they are, and we're also going to talk about variables. Variables are how you store these data types, or a variable is used to store data, and there are various types of data. So your variables can have different types, right? And based on that, you can manipulate them. There are different ways you can manipulate that variable. And then from there, I'll introduce the basic operators in Python from the ones that addition plus multiplication. We'll also go into division and also integer division, otherwise known as floor division, but we'll explain that later. And yeah, so we'll end up with using Python as a calculator just to get you to understand how to write Python code exactly. That was actually how I first learned. My background was in mechanical engineering. So essentially, once I realized how to use programming languages as a calculator, then I kind of got an understanding of how the program was working, and I could extend that knowledge to other more complicated or complex instructions. All right, let's get to it. So by the end of this, what we will learn, like I said, we're going to write some simple programs, Python programs. We're going to discuss variables and variable rules. Python literals are just exactly how you represent the data, right? Just the data that you input into Python, and then the operators and expressions. All right, so let's jump into it. Okay, so Visual Studio Code. First of all, download Visual Studio Code, and on this link provided here, you'll go there, and based on your operator, you will select. If you're using a Mac, download the one for Mac. If you're using Windows, I'm using Windows. All right, so once you're done, it should look something like this, right? And that's just the IDE, right? And as you can see, I've written here a first program. So the extension for Python files is .py. So whenever you want to create a Python file, the extension is .py. It's essentially a text file, but then the Python interpreter will be able to know that this is not just an ordinary text file, but this is a file that contains Python instructions. All right, cool. Data types in Python. All right. So what is a data type, right? A data type is a set of values that have a defined specific set of operation, right? They specify the type of data that can be held in a variable, right? So even though you have different types of data, you have text, you have numbers, etc., etc. So essentially, this is what this is referring to. We'll go deeper in the next slide. So in Python, we have the following data types. We have numeric, string, sequence, mapping, Boolean, and a set. All right, we'll just go through it. Numeric are just integers, floats and complex. Integer is just any whole number, can be negative and positive on that whole number line, right? Floats are essentially numbers that have a decimal fraction to them, right? Integers don't, they're whole numbers. Floats have a fractional component. Complex is just, if you're coming from the science background or mathematics background, you've heard of real numbers and imaginary numbers, right? So complex is the combination of those two. You have strings, just a sequence of characters, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, 1, 2, 3, and we will get deeper into that, right? Then you have a sequence. You have lists, tuples, and range, mapping. We'll get into this. Booleans, right? It's just essentially true or false. You use that to ask the computer or the program a question. So based on the answer, it'll execute a certain instruction, and a set is just a collection of unique items, right? So what are literals, right? So in Python, we have string literals, numeric literals, Booleans, collection literals, and special literals, excuse me. So numeric literals, like I've said, floats, integers, complex, and then collection, lists, and set, tuple, and dictionary. So we'll get into this once we start working on Visual Studio Code. And Python operators and operations, right? So a symbol that performs operation on values, essentially an operator, right? So if you have that, remember from mathematics, if you want to add two numbers together, you use addition. If you want to subtract something, you use a subtraction. If you want to increase something by a specific, if you want to multiply something, you use the multiplication, right? So, and then these things, remember in BODMAS and mathematics, there was an order of priority. So we also have that in programming, essentially. So addition has the lowest priority, and exponentiation, right? You raise something to the power, has the highest. We'll go through this once we get into, so these are just some examples of some Python code. Variables, let's go back to variables, okay? Actually, I think let's just leave the slides for now. I will open this in Visual Studio Code, okay? And once it's opened, I will start, all right? So how to begin? We are just for convention's sake or culture's sake, it's going to be the first program. And yes, I trust the author's first program, and I didn't finish. Let me rename that properly. First program. You don't have to. The Python. So now it knows it's a Python file. And there we go. All right. So what are we going to do first, right? First things first, I just want to output something to the terminal. So I'm going to say print hello world, right? We'll explain this in due time. Let's just run that. And there's the output. Hello world is out, right? That's the output of our code. Now, so we spoke about string literals over here. So I'll just show you what a string literal is, right? A string literal essentially is this. This is an example of one string literal there, right? That's a string literal. In Python, you can define strings using the double quotes or a single quote, right? Hello world. And that is a valid quote. That is a valid string, right? So that's a string in Python. You can also have multi-line strings, right? So we can have a multi-line string literal, right? And these in green are essentially comments, right? These are comments, and you can see they're in green. And essentially this, what is it, the hash sign? When the interpreter sees this, it's going to ignore this, all right? It's going to ignore this line and move to the next line. So now let's write a multi-line string. So in Python, you can write a multi-line string in two ways. One way is using 3 double quotes, all right? And then there, 3 quotes. You use double quotes as well. Multi-line string literal, okay? Use me. And then that's the first way you can do that. So I know this is on one line, but I could just do that and do that. So that's a string literal, right? So these are just literals. I haven't stored this anyway. If I was to run this, let's see what the output would be, right? Nothing. I'm not sending anything out to the console except for print hello world, right? And then the other way to do a string literal is this. You see, hello. And then I do that. And I say, no. That's one way of doing it. Let's just do this. See what happens there. Yeah, essentially, I just have to store this into a variable. So we can say that should work. And I will remove that space. So for that to work, you need to store it in a variable. And I jumped the gun here, but essentially what is happening here. So this is a variable. I've named it street. Not a good name, but this multi, right? I've named it string multi-line, and I've assigned it, right? I've hovered over the equal sign to this string over here, right? So essentially, I'm saying that this string is going to be stored in here. And from now on, I can represent that string as by calling this variable name, okay? But let's not go into that for now, okay? We'll talk about variable names later, about variables later. So now that's a string literal, right? So numeric literals, let's quickly talk about numeric literals, because I only talk about, for now, I'm going to talk about numeric and strings and Boolean. Once we get to lists, sets, tuples, dictionaries, we'll come back to that in the next video, okay? So then you have a float, right? Okay, let's start with an integer. Let's start with an integer. So what is an integer, right? An integer essentially is a whole number, right? And it can be signed, right? Signed, when I say that, can be a negative number as well, okay? So if I want to, this is a string literal, or this is an integer literal, sorry, excuse me. And that is an int, right? So let's comment 1, 2, 3, or negative 12, 1, 2, 3, right? And that is also an int. We can do, and that's an int, and that is an int, right? So we can do operations on these, right? We'll get to that now in the next step. And then we have floats, right? But now we can forget about complex as well, because I'm not going to use them anytime soon. So floats, right? Let's make this a comment. Let's say I want to store my weight. So I went to the gym today and I weighed myself, and I was weighing about, on the scale, and yeah, in kilograms, right? So that is an example of a float. And you can also have a negative float, right? Let's say you do some calculations and you end up with a negative factor of that, and then that is, let's put it to pretty significant numbers. So there, these are examples of floats, right? So let's continue on our variables. Now, what is a variable? Let's quickly go back to the slide. We'll come back to it. What is a variable? Now, a variable is essentially a placeholder for storing information. If you look on the left or on the right here, I have this envelope, and I've titled this envelope the best team. And I'm saying that Liverpool FC, I'm going to assign that to this envelope and store it there as the best team, right? So it can be named anything, but keep it relevant and meaningful, hence best team, right? So I had to keep it relevant and meaningful. No spaces in the variable name. So I couldn't put a space in between best and team. That would violate the naming conventions, right? It's a good practice to have names start with the lowercase letter. Can't have variables with the same name, and gets to that. And names should not clash with Python reserved names, right? So they're already stored. So they've been reserved by Python to do something. So you can't name your variable there, because there will be a clash when it's time to run the program. So if you look here, this is how you assign a variable. I say best team is equals to Liverpool FC. So essentially, I create a string literal of Liverpool FC, and assign this to best team. And when I say print, remember, print outputs something to the terminal, right? But outputs and inputs to the terminal. Here is the input is our variable that is storing Liverpool FC, and I've added a string to it saying is the best team. Okay, so we can get into that. Pip 8. So this is the style guide for Python code. It's essentially a standard for how to write your code in Python. I know this is an introductory lesson, but it would be good for you to know about this, and so that when you start learning how to write Python programs, you follow this convention. Okay. And variables. Okay, so that's the end of the slide. So let's now get back to that example. So over here, I'm going to say best team, right? It's just a comment. So I'm going to say best, and I'm going to actually rename that from how I did it and use pip 8. Best team